Policy Director here at Carbon Gap and the moderator for this panel. So I'm joined by this illustrious panel to discuss a central question to CDR. This panel is about what's at stake when thinking about creating a future compliance market for carbon removal. Hopefully the panel here will help to provide some of the answers and explain whether and how to think about compliance markets for CDR. Hopefully this will help set the scene. So the primary compliance market in Europe is, of course, the emissions trading system, which provides one option down the road, but there are other market-based or non-market-based approaches to consider. The panel consists of 4 speakers. We will each get a chance to have their say on the question of a compliance regime for CDR, and then we will open the discussion amongst the panelists. And lastly, we'll have around 10 minutes of audience Q&A, so please start thinking about your questions. And if you have a question, raise your hand, and my colleague will come around with a microphone. We also have our rapporteur with us in the audience, Sam van den Plas, who's Policy Director at Carbon Market Watch. He will take notes during this discussion and provide his own impressions at the plenary, which is scheduled for 12:15 today. So Sam will benefit from your insights soon. And with the housekeeping out of the way, I would like to kick off discussions by turning to MEP Lidia Pereira. Thank you for being with us today. You are the EP's rapporteur for the CRCF, the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, which is a foundational building block for carbon removal policy. Now that we have provisional agreement on the CRCF, what purpose would a compliance market fill?
Well, very good morning to everyone. And first of all, let me thank you the invitation to join you on this discussion in having the opportunity to help Europe leading the way on this matter. So first of all, a compliance market removal, a compliance market for carbon dioxide removal, it could serve several purposes. Aiming at mitigating climate change and reducing the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. So it serves 2 purposes. And the main objectives for the constitution of such markets can include, first of all, regulatory compliance, as this helps companies, governments, organizations to meet regulatory carbon requirements or carbon emission reduction targets, because there's entities that cannot reduce emissions internally, but they can buy carbon credits from those who can remove CO2 from the atmosphere, at the same time ensuring compliance with environmental regulations or carbon neutrality goals. Another element here is to incentivize carbon dioxide removals. So if we put a price on carbon emissions and rewarding the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere, a compliance market can incentivize the development and the deployment, and this is particularly relevant, of carbon removal technologies and practices. This is something that is central in the carbon removal certification framework. At least that was the spirit with which we led the negotiations. So this financial incentive can accelerate innovation and scaling up the CDR solutions. Another element for a reflection is of the importance of this compliance market is quantifying and verifying emissions and removals. So a compliance market establishes methodologies for quantifying, verifying, reporting emissions and removals, and this ensures integrity and transparency in the market, and allows buyers to trust that their investments genuinely contribute to carbon dioxide removal. I have here a couple of other notes, but I will summarize perhaps on three. One other is economic efficiency, and this relates to market mechanisms. So a compliance market for CDR aims to find the most cost-effective ways to reduce atmospheric CO2 by allowing the market to set prices on carbon removal credits. It encourages competition, innovation, driving down the costs of carbon removal technologies and strategies. Another element that I think is of great importance is the global collaboration. So carbon dioxide is a global pollutant with worldwide impacts, and a compliance market of CDR can facilitate international cooperation and financial flows from entities in high emission countries to carbon removal projects in countries where those projects can be more effectively or efficiently implemented. So I think overall the compliance market for carbon dioxide removal aims to address the urgent needs to reduce CO2 levels while promoting sustainable practices, economic growth, and let me underline this aspect, economic growth. We need economic growth in Europe to be sitting in the front row of innovation, technology, and address the challenges that are multiple and global, and obviously innovation in the CDR technology. So this is in summary what I think constitute the most important elements for the purpose that I think CDR a compliance market for CDR could fill.
Thank you, Lidia, for your remarks. We're also joined with Michael Pahle, who's the head of the Climate and Energy Policy Working Group at the Potsdam Institute. Michael, given your vast experience with the ETS, what is your view of what a compliance market for CDR would need to fulfill, whether that's CDR's inclusion in the ETS or in a separate system?
Yeah, thanks so much. Also, good morning from my side. I'm very happy to be here. Before I go into the ETS, I want to echo what I think are really first principles for the discussion. And they came up in your intervention, Lidia, and earlier this morning. So it's really, in essence, about cost effectiveness. That's why we use markets in the first place. Otherwise, we could use regulation. And about environmental integrity. So in my view, this is above all. There are a lot of other aspects, but they can be directly or indirectly derived from these very principles. And I think everyone would agree to that. I think there is no controversy here. But I think the challenge is that these two principles stand in a certain trade-off. You cannot have both of them at the same time under all kind of conditions, basically. And that's, I think, really the main challenge that we are facing, to find the right balance, also acknowledging that considerations for these principles change over time as we have new experiences and we learn about new technologies and experiment in the desired direction. So coming to the ETS, so I'm very thankful that you made a rather specific proposal by saying the focus should move away from the ETS and towards a separate and dedicated system. I think that's very helpful for discussion, not necessarily because I think that's a straightforward recipe for implementation, but really as a thought experiment and how to relate these to the different principles. And having a long experience in the ETS and being a big fan of it, to be fully transparent, of course the question that would need to be answered is why? Why are you proposing this? So what is the main argument cautioning against that integration? And I think, and this is kind of the big elephant in the room, that there is reason to be concerned that in the mid to long run, what I would call the dark side of CDR would take over. So I think this is the big problem here, and I think it's a very valid point. I'm not saying that's likely. I do not want to make any assessments. But we already had a sort of precedence in the past, the episode where we had the inclusion of international credits. These were not a homemade problem. I think we have more control over these things in Europe, but we have, I think, made some experience and learned some lessons. So it cannot be, moved away easily. And this is a consideration, I think, from which one must derive the recommendation that we start with a separate system, because we have full control over it. If something goes wrong, the problems will be contained and they will not spill over to the ETS. I think that's the big plus. But at the same time, and this is another important consideration when it comes to management, these expectations. So we want to manage first the expectation that something will not, that the dark side will not take over. So it's very important, because then we lose trust and then we lose investments. But at the same time, another important expectation is that this, doing this as a first step is not a plan for the long term, because ultimately we need to bring back CDR into the EU climate policy architecture. And at the core of this architecture is the ETS. And if you think about cost effectiveness, then in the long run at least, and having assured that there are high quality permanent removals, we need to have a system that balances the price of removals and reductions. So envisage the state, and let's say around 2040, we will have some residual emissions or hard-to-abate emissions that will need to be balanced by removals. And finding the right price and the right amount of both of it is a purpose for the market. So that's what we need the market for in the long run, to ensure cost effectiveness. So making a final point, I think we should not antagonize these two options or see that as different choices, but I think we should think more about a pathway or a sequencing approach, potentially starting with a separate system, then make up our minds how we could move over time and partially and gradually integrate this system into the ETS, taking into consideration that there will be substantial learning and formulating contingencies in a similar way, more or less, as we did it with the ETS2 and the linking question that is looming behind it.
Thank you, Michael. I think we all agree we don't want CDR to go to the dark side. We're also joined with Mette Quinn. She's the Deputy Director for Carbon Markets and Clean Mobility at the European Commission. Mette, is integrating CDR into the ETS a good fit? What are the benefits and what are the risks, both from a perspective of the ETS and from the perspective of a sustainable scale-up of carbon removal?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion this morning. And I can also only agree with what has already been said, and I'm very happy to hear that various options are now being considered. So, of course, from my point of view, the ETS is a very good instrument, and we have seen a lot of emission reductions under the ETS until now. But we are now moving into a next phase of the ETS potentially. So we have been thinking a lot about the role of carbon removals and whether it can play a role in the EU ETS. And there are many considerations that we need to look into. So first of all, we have just released two important communications from the Commission in this area. We have the Industrial Carbon Management Strategy that Alex was talking about earlier, and also the new 2040 climate target communication. And the analysis from that one indeed shows that if we want to reach 90% emission reduction by 2040, then we cannot do it all by mitigating the emissions. We need to also have the removals. So we do, and the strong drive is really to ensure that we have full implementation of the legislation until 2030, but we also need to look at what kind of reliable framework could we have for removing the remaining unavoidable emissions. And there it is, should we integrate carbon removals into the ETS? Is that a viable solution? And we need to study that really in detail. But we also need to look at other options. And one option, or one element that we really need to look at is how do we finance the removals? Is it the ETS, or what other financing options are there? And here I could come with many different elements, but there are voluntary markets, there are compliance markets, public funding. There's a lot of different areas that want public funding now, so we also need to see that we are in a very constrained budgetary time. We have many different elements that need to be funded, and to what extent could public authorities procure removal? So we have a lot of constraints that we are working under in this area. Then there are also a number of issues that are still not clear regarding the removals themselves. So we have DACs that really need a lot of energy. Are we able to have all this renewable energy, and by when? We have the bio CCS, or the BECS, and they need an awful lot of biomass, or we need to use a lot of land for this. So we have also many competing needs for using the land. So how do we have this whole system put in place? I think we also need to look at, and not at the ETS in isolation. So what we need to do while we are looking at those elements, we also need to see by 2026 whether indeed removals could be integrated into the ETS. If they are safe and permanently stored and accounted for, and these are big elements. So then what could I see as main benefits? Of course, I agree. It could support the demand for removals by having them in the ETS, and there could also be an increased investor certainty from including in the ETS, that there is indeed a market for the removals. It can potentially also mitigate the high cost of certain removal solutions by driving the innovation further by having them in the ETS. And then, of course, the emissions that certain industry sectors cannot abate themselves could be abated by the removals. So there are certainly some possible positive elements, but then there are also some risks and some shortcomings. And one of the risks is that we really need to look into is the market itself. How does the cap, how will it affect the cap, the price, and therefore the overall mitigation options in the system? And this we really need to study in detail. And we will also have to look at potential safeguards that would be needed. And this links to the elements that I was saying before. What kind of removals can we expect, and how do they affect the mitigation? Because that's another thing. We only want, or we only can afford removals for the very hard to abate emissions. And that is a moving target as well. With innovation, what was hard to abate emissions 5 years ago is not what is hard to abate emissions today, and that picture will continue to evolve. So how much removals do we actually need, and could we integrate? And then another point there is also the price differential. In order for the ETS to really be a source of demand, we need to have the price in the ETS that is so we can buy the removals. And there is a significant gap, and we might need additional systems such as carbon contracts for difference in order to address that the carbon price is not high enough compared to the cost of the removals. And my last point is that in the long term, the ETS might not be a solution either when we go post-2040, but we can always come into that later. So we have a number there are potential good elements, but there are also potential risks, and we need to study them all before we can say whether the ETS is a good fit for removals. Thank you.
Thank you, Mette. I think there's a lot in there that our other panelists will want to come in on. We have, as our fourth panelist, Tamme. She's the Managing Director at Climate Principles, and she's also the chair of the Zero Emissions Platform. Eva, is it important for CDR to be integrated into key policies across the EU's climate policy framework? So not just the ETS or a compliance market, but what about roles of policies such as the effort sharing regulation what should be the guiding principles when we think about CDR's integration into the EU's climate policy framework?
Thank you, Davina, and thank you everyone for coming upstairs. I can't believe the compliance markets get a full room. I didn't expect it. That's great. Very glad to be here today to discuss topics that I find very, very interesting. I would actually first want to talk about something very basic and general because I feel like it might be useful for some of the audience, because we keep talking about compliance markets and then usually what comes up is the ETS. But if you talk about carbon markets in general, we do have compliance markets and we have the voluntary carbon markets. And compliance markets don't necessarily need to be cap and trade systems like the ETS. You can also have carbon crediting mechanism as a compliance market if there is a clear mandate for which it has to be used. So normally compliance markets are just the markets that are used to help achieve the climate targets. So in our case, yes, we mostly talk about ETS, the world's most successful cap and trade system, obviously. But also, if you think about the carbon removal certification framework, which currently is kind of seen as a voluntary tool, if that would become mandatory, that would essentially become a kind of a compliance market using a carbon crediting as a mechanism instead of cap and trade. So just kind of putting this information out there as a background. Many good points have already been made. I fully agree that markets are not actually this first and only thing that will make one or the other thing happen, whether you speak about removals or some other technologies. These questions keep coming up, like what should the market price be so that it will make it work? No, we need many other things as well. But if you look at the EU policy design right now, we have the three pillars. We have the emissions trading system, we have the effort sharing regulation, and we have the land use change and forestry regulation. So the last one already has some removals in it, I would say conventional CDR activities like afforestation, reforestation. And now the question is about all these novel carbon removal activities. Should this be in a separate pillar or should this be incorporated into ESR or ETS, or how it actually would look in practice? And what are the principles, as Davina asked? And in my view, actually, it makes sense to start with climate targets as this very first principle, because if we have very clear separate targets for reductions and removals, then actually it doesn't matter if the removals are accounted for within the ESR framework or in a separate pillar, the end result is the same. So sometimes I feel like stakeholders are getting a bit ahead of the real discussions by talking about the policy design, but not yet having understood what are we actually designing for. So this is the first and foremost thing that we really need to get clarity on. And one thought I want to also leave you with here is it really matters today. As we heard, novel CDR is such a vibrant ecosystem. There's so much innovation there. There are actually very few types of carbon removal activities countries can today account for against their climate targets. So there are those things that can be accounted for today, but even some of these, like bioenergy with CCS, you can account for it because of the inventory rules the IPCC has created. Once we have projects up and running, we actually don't have any yet. But then because of the system we have currently, the effort sharing regulation, where it would normally fall under, actually doesn't allow to count it against its target because it's limited to only emission reductions. So even some things that we can account for today, we cannot actually count against the climate targets. So how we go about it, what can we account for, how are we counting things against targets, what about more novel things that will probably be always outside of these accounting frameworks, how are we going to incentivize those? I think we should have a lot more specific discussions on separate CDR activities, making clear what fits where and then how are we going to incentivize it.
Thank you. I think you raised a really interesting point around the other steps that need to be taken before we can properly consider establishing the compliance market. So a question to all of the panelists. What first steps do we need to take and what needs to be in place before we could look at a compliance framework for CDR? We could start with Lidia, thanks.
Thank you. Well, I think, and since I'm still very, digesting the good agreement that was possible to achieve on the carbon removal certification framework, CRCF. I think we need to let the markets function first and see. This is a first step. I cannot tell you if it's in 1 year or 2 years, but to understand how the market reacts to that. And when I say market, I'm referring to all the different stakeholders that constitute these markets and that enable the technologies to flourish. One of the things that I think it is critical on the voluntary markets and on the scaling up of the technologies so far is the fact that we have a very fragmented capital markets in Europe. And this is something of crucial importance, because if we want to be key competitors in the global framework, we need to enable the markets to flourish, and for that we need a capital markets union. So I'm saying this because we are ahead of the European elections, and I would love to see the political groups, at least my own is on board for that, to put this as a priority, because this will be one step forward in developing the technologies, in enabling the markets to function, and to assess what needs to be further regulated. So this is, I think, something that I would consider as a first step, and obviously not losing sight of the possibilities of connecting the voluntary markets and the ETS. Actually, in the CRCF, I think if you had the chance to go through the text, that is not directly written there, but there is a window of opportunity for that. But we need first, and I really want to insist on this, to let the markets function, and we need to take the know-how that Europe has on this front and scaling up, because this will be, the US will eventually follow, China will have to follow, India will have to follow, and we cannot expect that Europe is going to mitigate climate change alone. So we need to bring the others on board, and here we have the possibility to do so. So this is what would be my first comment.
I very much agree to everything that has been said, and I'm trying to make one additional point. But first of all, really, I want to amplify the necessity of scaling up and having a view on the international development, because we are seeing a lot of momentum elsewhere in the world, but what is lacking there, I think, is a long-term perspective. That's my experience from discussions in the US, where everyone is, okay, let's do it. There's a let's do it mentality. But everyone is aware that at some point you need to link it up to compliance system and to proper policy architectures. So that is missing. And I think we have done extremely well in developing our own compliance market, learning from that. We have the certification framework, which is a crucial first step, gets rid of all the unclarities and sets standards for methodologies, monitoring, reporting. Okay, everyone knows that. But I think one element that we need in addition is financial regulation. So the voluntary carbon market in many ways has been very helpful, but it has also been Wild West. And we are not seeing for relevant parts of the market a proper financial trading. So we do need transparent markets under clear financial regulation that needs to be in the midterm aligned with the regulations that we have for the compliance market. So we need to aim for harmonization. And I'm not meaning integration. I'm just meaning harmonization of the financial regulation. Because in that respect, the compliance market could already give guidance to the voluntary market. And we are already seeing in various parts of the markets and segments of the market, we are seeing an indirect financial linkage already. So it will come up sooner rather than later. And I think going that route over financial regulation, which maybe might be even faster to accomplish, given that processes are going on also on the international level, I think is a very important element for making these markets work in a very synergetic way.
Thank you. Just a small comment, and I can agree with everything that has been said, more or less. I think what we do need is, on the one side, indeed, we need the CRCF now to start working, and we need to focus on how to scale up the removals, so the funding and the market, but also the various elements that we can bring from public funding, and there are a number of elements we can do there. But then I think we are also already on the way. Then we need to see at what are exactly the regulatory elements that we need to put in place, and this is where we have this discussion, and we start now really looking into it, at earnest. What are the best markets that we could see for the removals, also in the little bit longer term.
Speaking glass is always the hardest, so I'll try to add to what has been said. And maybe, again, starting from the basics, markets are not the goal of itself. Markets are a tool, and historically they're a tool to put a price on carbon and make it as cost efficient, as Michael said, to reduce emissions as possible. When we talk about removals, it's slightly different, because we're not putting the price on carbon in the same way. You might think that's the case if you just think about balancing emissions with removals, and you think, well, those who are still emitting will need to take care of the removals. But over time, we need to get to the place where there are a lot more removals than emissions. Hence, it's not anymore going to look like only the polluters pay. We will need to think of a different system, and that's a challenge. So what I'm trying to say is that creating markets for removals, it is more challenging than what we have done so far. We can learn a lot from it, but there are other things we need to consider. Some of these, for example, removal projects don't really easily happen by themselves. There's quite a bit of need of kind of pre-purchasing, like financing upfront. How do you build that into the system so that it can start working? Is there any role for some type of removal activities, for example, for contracts for difference to make up for the difference of carbon price? As we know today in the ETS, the carbon price is actually lower than we expected to see during this year, but hopefully that will change. So the challenge is that designing for removals is learning everything we have from designing for reductions, but we need to add some more filters on it to make it really work. And that's going to be fascinating to see take shape.
Thank you. We've got time now for some audience questions. So my colleagues are roaming around with microphones. If you do have a question you'd like to ask, please raise your hand. And we'll collect a few at a go.
Hi, thank you all so much. That was really illuminating. My name is Laura Hurley. I work for Chiron, but previously I led on UK CDR policy. My question for the panel, and possibly it's for you, Michael, is it not very important to send a clear signal at some point, sooner rather than later, that removals will be part of ETS? The investment power behind that, given the fact that ultimately a market is the most cost-efficient way of achieving net zero, and given the fact that kind of signals like that drive investment, do you think that there would be a huge power in sending that signal sooner rather than later?
Good morning, Werner Stoofs. I thought this was a very interesting panel. Thank you very much for that. I have two questions. One on CDR compliance markets. We've heard a lot on ETS. Eva has also kind of hinted towards ESR, which some also describe as a compliance market because there's trading between countries. There are alternatives to ETS. We've heard this morning as well from Sylvain downstairs. Removal trading scheme has been put forward. Also, I think I might be the first one to use this acronym, RARS, a removal effort sharing regulation. I don't think it's a nice acronym. Maybe it'll catch on. I hope not. But would that not also fulfill all the principles you raised? I heard constraints, separate targets. I heard cost effectiveness. Are there not other alternatives that also fulfill these principles rather than the ETS that we focus on a lot? And then I have a question for Michael. I'm intrigued by the concept of dark side of CDR. Could you perhaps show us a bit what you're thinking there? Who is this? And I'd be concerned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for a fascinating discussion. I just had a question around a potential agricultural ETS, and I know that there's already been work carried out at EU level into investigating what shape that could take. Really interested how you see the development of that, whether that is something that may come sooner rather than later, and perhaps considering that in relation to the political pressures on the agriculture and farming sector.
Thank you. So we could start with Michael. You had quite a... We'll start with Eva. Yes, I'm always leaving Eva till last.
No, I'm also happy to be first sometimes. So Laura's question on signal. I think the political signal obviously will be important, because when we talk about policy making, it's all about providing clarity to the businesses and ideally kind of this policy predictability and policy certainty, and that's super helpful. But I do see that there is a bit of a challenge, like we need to understand a bit more than just will certain activities be part of ETS. We need to understand how exactly that will work in practice, because many of these activities might not necessarily happen just because project developers know that they might be part of the ETS, because they might still need some upfront funding. So that's kind of the practical question around it. Thanks, Wijnen, for bringing up the ESR a bit more strongly. I felt like I spent too much time on other topics and I didn't really dwell on this before. But in my view, it would be very easy to just create a framework where, you know, what's under ETS is under ETS and everything else is under ESR, which is how it works now. But it's just, instead of limiting ESR to emissions and emission reductions, you also include removals in it. So by default, then all the removals will be accounted there. And then if the targets are clearly separate, you don't need to have a separate pillar for removals. They can easily be accounted for under ESR, as long as it's clear what are the country's removals targets and emission reduction targets. So this is what I said, the principle, what are we actually trying to do, and then deciding how to do it. The agriculture ETS I will leave for Mette.
Yes, thank you. Maybe I will start there on the agricultural ETS. So you're aware we have already been studying different options for whether it would be feasible to do an ETS for agriculture. I mean, going a step back from there, it's a sector where emission reductions are really needed, that we haven't, and it's one of the few sectors that are left that we haven't put under an emission trading system. So this is, of course, shall we say, even obvious that we look into options for that. At the same time, we have a European budget where a third of the money goes to the agricultural sector, and that is probably not possible to continue in the longer run, as we discussed also earlier, that there will be a lot of pressure on using the EU budget for new things. And at the same time, as we have just seen here in Brussels over the last few weeks, there's a huge political pressure from the farming sector and on the farming sector. So yes, we are looking into options for an ETS, but it's a very, very political area, so it's very difficult to give any answers on that right now.
Yeah, to relate to this, I think from this point on, everything is very political. That is my impression. And that brings me to the issue of what should be the long-term guidance or the long-term signal. I think the main question to clarify or to ask ourselves is which elements of the policy architecture are durable. So which elements will stay with us through 2050? And frankly, I have my doubts that the ESR will be more long-lived than the ETS. So I'm seeing the ETS growing despite all political challenges, and I'm seeing less and less of a case for the ESR, not because I think it's not an important element, but to some extent there's a case for it being superseded by the ETS development. It's not without risk or anything. I mean, I'm not making an assessment. I'm just giving my own personal scenario. because in the way I see the discussion going on and being streamlined. And there's also some interesting precedents here or past experience to draw on in case of the ESR. So we do have that system of a very fine grid target settings. We had it in a similar way for renewables in the past. And I think we are moving away from that fine-grained target setting. So we want a bigger system because we have much higher gains in terms of cost effectiveness. Again, it's not without its risks, but I think this is the way things are evolving. And in terms of the additional systems and the necessity of a target, I very much agree with Eve that we need a target, and then the question how we implement it is actually of second order. But Mette has made a very important point in terms of the financial constraints and the limited fiscal space that we are having. And what we are currently seeing in Germany with the climate contract for difference, carbon contract for difference, is a very telling experience. So we do have 24 billion euros dedicated to this new instrument, but it will be one shot. So already the expectation is put out that this will be the only 2 rounds, and afterwards the new direction will be to move towards green lead markets. So again, we are converging towards market again and again everywhere we look. And so this is why I would certainly underpin that it's important, because it's so plausible as a long-term development, that we need to make clear that at some point there is an entry pathway into the compliance market. And on the dark side,
Thank you. Lidia, please.
I will make just a very quick general comment on the 3 questions that were raised in saying this. So, on the case of the carbon removal certification framework, we are talking about an instrument that addresses a climate target, right? We want to be climate neutral by 2050. We have intermediate targets, and this particular instrument serves a purpose. The purpose that we cannot just go through the mitigation policies. We need to remove carbon from the atmosphere in order to be able to achieve the intermediate and the climate neutrality by 2050. So obviously, and in particular in relation to the ETS on agriculture, I think it really depends on the targets that we set. And then we use the instruments, which are policies, in order to achieve those targets. But I also want to make a reflection, because since it is a very political discussion, I think everything in the end of the day becomes political, even the most technical detail. So what we have in Europe at the moment is not only a question of tension with the farming sector. It is also a matter of food security. I think we've been underestimating the geopolitical context for quite some time, and I do not expect that things are going to become easier to handle. So we also have to take into account this. We need to feed Europe. We need to feed Europeans. But obviously, we also have the commitment with the environment. So we will have to find a balance between the 2, knowing that the current political situation is very uncertain. Not only on the European side, we have the European elections in June, but we also have the presidential elections in the US. We had some sort of elections, or whatever you can call it, in Russia this weekend. But I mean, things are moving, and the uncertainty is quite the basis of that. But I want to flag this importance of the farming sector in striking the balance between the climate goals, but as well food security in Europe.
Thank you so much. We're approaching the end of our panel. And to finish up, I wanted to ask each of you a rapid-fire question. So we've agreed on some things, the need for clear and long-term targets for CDR, and we've disagreed on some things. What conclusions would you draw from this discussion? And where should we go next?
Okay, I think one of the big questions that I want to kind of leave you with is really, what are we designing for? Again, echoing what Michael said, that comes first, and then we can design the policies according to that afterwards. But I wanted to leave like a little last message for you. Didn't come up in this context, but I think it's an important in these discussions. We really need to start working on being able to nest the project-based accounting for removals with national accounting for removals, and we have so many issues there today. So when everyone who's doing carbon removal projects, they're actually thinking they're contributing to climate targets. In reality today, they are not, because we haven't made the proper links. So let's get started on fixing those things.
Yes, thank you. And for me, I think indeed I am glad that this discussion has moved a little bit out of the ETS. I saw for a while there was always the ETS and integration in the ETS. But I'm glad that we look at a number of different markets. And indeed, I would agree with Eve. We need to be clear about why. And then we need to find what is the right solution. And it's probably a market solution in one way or the other, but there's still more to be looked into for that.
For me, it was striking today to see again how much agreement there is on many issues. I think we do not have really hard controversies here. They might be shaded because we are not going into the details. So echoing what you said, that ultimately it will be political. But I think on the general principle level, there's a lot of agreement here. And I think the main challenge for us is really tackling all the complexity. So we know it's not a question of a dedicated system or one option versus the other. I mean, the whole architecture, the whole framework will come in. And so I think the challenge is to sort it all out and not to lose view of the differentiation between concrete instruments and elements that give guidance in the long term. And so for me, the kind of metaphor I see for the ETS is that of a North Star that gives guidance. That is not necessarily the instrument to integrate right away, but if I'm right, everything moves towards markets and the ETS, so we should use it as orientation and work from there.
Well, finally, I want to underline an element that I referred at the beginning of my intervention, which is economic growth. We really need to tackle economic growth. We need to make sure that Europe remains competitive. So competitiveness is crucial in the next decades. We have a European social model to pay. We have a growing or aging society in Europe. So we have a lot of challenges. We have climate change, obviously. So what I expect, or what I would like to see in the coming years, is that competitiveness comes as a key element, and together with the scaling up of the technologies that we have in front of us that will allow us to comply with the climate neutrality and lead the way for other geographies in the world to follow. This is critical, and this is something that I think ahead of the European elections, this is also very important for all of you that are here with us, to bring some sort of, not to bring compromise, because compromise was possible in the end, but we will have to strike a balance as well at the political forums, or at the between the political groups, to combine the two things that I'm referring to: competitiveness on the one hand, climate change on the other. And I do think that the civil society, so all of you, are of crucial importance to make sure that we achieve all the goals, that we circumvent or we surpass the obstacles that we have in front of us, because the times, as I said, it's a bit uncertain. So I do believe that we need a strong civil society to be the backbone of a strong political leadership in both competitiveness and on climate change, and in particular on carbon removals.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. It's been a very enlightening and rich discussion, so very grateful for that. We're now going into our coffee break. After the break, we'll have another 2 parallel sets of panels. So if you come back upstairs, After your coffee, the topic will be, what does a justice-centred approach to European CDR look like? And if you stay downstairs, the panel session will be how to target EU funding to scale up CDR research, development, and innovation. So your choice, funding or justice.